All right. So the title of this article is How the West is Looting Botswana, DeBeers and Western Capitalism's Exploitation of Botswana's Diamond Wealth. You guys may have heard of DeBeers. We've been talking before. One of the biggest diamond companies in the world. Very controversial. Let's get into the article. For decades, Western corporations, primarily De Beers, have been profiting off immensely from Botswana's diamond resources, often at the expense of the country's long-term economic development. The monopolistic control De Beers has, it was through a joint venture with Debswana with the Botswana government. They have maintained a near monopoly on the country's diamond production. This arrangement has allowed the company to exert significant control over pricing and distribution, potentially limiting Botswana's ability to maximize returns on its natural resources. Now, Cecil Rhodes was the founder of De Beers, having established the company in 1888. He initially gained a foothold in the diamond industry by acquiring the claims to diamond mines in South Africa, particularly after purchasing the De Beers mine in 1871. Now, Rhodes was instrumental in consolidating diamond mining operations in the region, which led to the formation of De Beers Consolidated Mines Limited through a merger with Barney Barnato's interests. The company was named after the farm owned by the Dutch settlers Diederik Arnoldus de Beer and Johannes Nicholas de Beer, where diamonds were first discovered in their area. Well, under Rhodes' leadership, De Beers quickly became the dominant force in the diamond industry, controlling a significant portion of the global supply and establishing practices that maintain high diamond prices through controlled distribution. And this is a common theme with De Beers through the years, is the way that the monopoly on diamonds makes it so they can fix prices in the industry and get them for incredible prices from Africa and turn around and sell them for huge markups in the Western world. And it goes without saying, here's Botswana. It's a medium-sized country. It's not the smallest, not the biggest. Right in the middle, next to Namibia. It was originally sort of created because Namibia was German, right? It was a German colonialist state, and so we wanted to get in there and sort of be the British kind of what the British did was the British came in and made it a protectorate because they were afraid of that German influence and they wanted to have their own colonialist projects. And as you know, Africa, it was cut up among all the different colonialist countries, right? You had Portugal cut up their part, you have the Dutch cut up their part, you have the British cut up their part, the French and the Germans. And this is what it looks like today in the capital, of course, Gaborone. This is Cecil Rhodes, the man in question who started De Beers. He was also a merciless colonialist who was responsible for a lot of treachery and misery throughout the years. Like we said before, De Beers, through its joint venture with Debswana and the Botswana government, produces about 35% of rough diamonds worldwide. So a lot of diamonds coming out of there. The venture that they have, the agreement that they have, is a 50-50 joint venture, meaning the profits are shared equally. Botswana is the world's largest diamond producer by value, accounting for about 25% of global production. So just one country produces a quarter of it. And in 2005, the Botswana's rough diamond production value was about 3.3 billion. And that's a lot. That's actually a lot for an industry, which is just mining from one country. It's sort of incredible how much diamonds they actually have. As of 2011, the diamond beneficiation industry in Botswana employed about 3,000 people, 88% who were Botswana. So they do employ the local people as if they would have a choice. And some of the rough stones that were flown out of Botswana usually go to places like US, Belgium, Israel, India, and China. And this is where they go to sort them, cut them, polish them, and everything. And they've been talking about renegotiating these contracts because the president of Botswana just said, hey, this 50-50 thing that we have going, we need to rethink this because we're not getting the good end of the deal here. We're actually getting a pretty rotten end of the deal, if you want to know the truth. So here's the distribution of diamond production worldwide based on value in 2022 by country. As you see here in the blue, Botswana is the leader, followed by Russia. Then you have Angola, Canada, South Africa, and then the rest of the world. So Botswana, pretty much a heavy hitter when it comes to diamonds. So, and that'll play into some of the story as we get started later. And I have to say, Botswana isn't the worst place in Africa economically because of the vast amounts of diamonds that they do have. Even with the 50-50 split that they have, they've come out on top and managed their economy better than other African countries, as we always talk about in this program about the IMF coming in and, debt trapping African countries and getting them into a cycle of debt. IMF tried that with Botswana, but they really didn't ever have a lot of deep debt with the IMF or Western institutions. They were able to efficiently manage their economic situation a little bit better. So historically, DeBeers exported rough diamonds from Botswana for sorting, cutting, and polishing elsewhere. This has typically been a practice that has deprived Botswana of valuable jobs and skill development opportunities. Even today, despite some improvements, much of the value addition still occurs outside the country. So they could very easily give people jobs within Botswana doing the polishing and stuff like that. But of course, as Western capitalists, we refuse to do that. So even though it's a 50-50 venture, a lot of the critics still argue that the real profits are skewed in the favor of DeBeers. Obviously, if they're only coming down and extracting the stuff. And the other big thing, too, is that lab-grown competition is starting to pop up, which is actually hurting DeBeers in a good way. So this is actually a positive development. The rise in lab-grown diamonds is putting pressure on natural diamond prices, with the lab-grown diamonds being up to 85% cheaper. Western capitalist interests have encouraged Botswana's overdependence on diamond revenues, leaving the country vulnerable to market fluctuations and potentially stunting the development of other economic sectors. So this was also true about places like Argentina or places like the DRC, or places where they only have one commodity, and when the price of that commodity goes into the toilet, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. This was, in fact, the case with Libya because they were so heavily on the oil, as well as Venezuela, these oil-rich nations who didn't diversify. When oil prices tanked, then they were in a really rough spot financially because that was their main export. Blah, blah, blah. This is how it is. The other thing about the uneven nature of this relationship between Botswana and DeBeers is the technology transfer. So you guys might not know this, but China invited American companies to China in the late 20th century and said, you can come to China and set up your factories as long as you teach us what you're doing. That was called the technology transfer. You transferred over the way things are done to the people who live there so that they understand how to do it themselves. It's a reasonable request to say, look, you want to come here and you want to take our stuff, at least teach us how you do it. Despite decades of involvement, Western companies have been slow to transfer critical mining and processing technologies to Botswana, maintaining their technological edge and country's dependence on foreign expertise. Basically saying, don't worry about doing all that stuff. Let us take care of that for you because you're too stupid to figure it out. But in reality, that would cut in on their gig altogether. And that would leave Botswana in a position where they were a rich country if they did. Also, large-scale diamond mining operations driven by Western demand have raised environmental concerns, of course, land degradation, water depletion. This is always a byproduct of capitalism. Now, you might ask some people that they don't care about environmental degradation. It is very important, and it is a byproduct of colonialism. So let's talk about colonialism, because there has been a history of colonialism in Botswana. As we mentioned before, Botswana was known as the Bechuana Land Protectorate during this British colonial rule, and experienced significant exploitation and injustices that shaped its socioeconomic landscape. So, in 1885, the British declared the Bechuana Land a protectorate to prevent German and Boer expansion, prioritizing strategic interests over local welfare. So, of course, they didn't want to look out for anybody's concerns in the region. They mostly were doing it as an strategic expansion against Germans, who at that time were expanding rapidly. Colonial authorities appropriated vast tracts of land for white settlers and cattle ranching, displacing indigenous Tswana communities as an indigenous group. This land dispossession disrupted traditional livelihoods and forced many into labor for colonial enterprises. Now, you fast forward to the 1960s, the discovery of diamonds transformed Botswana's economy, but primarily benefited only Western companies. And of course, we know now that it was particularly the DeBeers company, which established the control over the diamond industry. The colonial economy was structured to serve British interests, focusing on raw material extraction rather than developing any kind of local industries. And this created a cycle of dependency that still, exists today. But there's also, in the colonial residues left over, you have cultural suppression and social disruption, that the British administration systematically dismantled traditional Tswana political structures, undermining local leadership and cultural practices. This erosion of authority led to social fragmentation and the loss of cultural identity. And of course, this is modus operandi of any colonialist power, is to take indigenous tribes that are the type to live off the land and not be prone to resource extraction. You want to neutralize indigenous communities, right? You want to stop them from imparting their ecocentric view of the world. Not to mention the forced labor. So it wasn't as severe as in other colonies, but not to water it down, the British employed very coercive measures to ensure that they had cheap labor for mines and farms, and they did subject their workers to harsh conditions, as they do for any grunt labor. As you see, people who pick berries for Driscoll's, the American company that does, berries of certain kind, they look it up. They have terrible history of treating their workers terribly. So it's like a neo-colonialist kind of vibe. Colonial education policies favored small elite, leaving the majority of the population without access to quality of education. This has created long-lasting disparities in socioeconomic development. So you still have vast amounts of poor people who maybe aren't involved in the diamond industry, but are, and because they're not, they are, living in poverty more so than people who are. Access to important social programs and everything like that, which, it's hard. The colonial government neglected also public health, leading to disease outbreaks and high mortality rates among indigenous population, exacerbating suffering during and after the colonial rule. So they also, this is typical among colonialists, is to disenfranchise indigenous people, but also expose them to diseases and kill them that way. When we gave smallpox to the Native Americans, wasn't moral, but it did help us in our quest to be colonialist kind of, I don't know, assholes and take over the world. Pardon my French. So it moves on to another interesting aspect of this story. So you have Botswana, you have these companies like DeBeers coming in, extracting the resources before and after the colonialism. And you have all these historical examples of the West meddling in during the colonialist times. Well, after you had Western Cold War influence in the region. So during the Cold War, Western powers, particularly the United States, they employed various strategies to try to exert influence in Africa. So they were obviously in competition with the Russians, the Soviets at the time, and they had to figure out a way to counter the influence in Africa, which, you know, Westerners had always felt pretty strongly about having control over Africa, and they ruled with an iron fist since 1492. Christopher Columbus, and it just kept persisting. Well, when the Cold War started, Russia had found itself in the region trying to peddle influence as well. So the U.S. backed anti-communist leaders, regardless of their human rights record. A prime example is this guy right here. Sorry, this fella here. This guy is named Mobutu Sese. Now, he was a U.S.-backed anti-communist leader who was in Zaire, which is now the Democratic Republic of Congo, who received substantial U.S. support despite his corruption and oppressive rule. So this is just an example of sort of the type of corruption that would happen that would open the doors for more Western meddling and more Western imperialism, which it persists today. The United States has its own strategies on keeping their influence in there and putting in puppet regimes. We've covered that a lot on this show. Western powers also engaged in indirect conflicts by supporting one side in civil wars. In Angola, the U.S.-backed UNITA rebels against the Soviet-supported MPLA government, prolonging the civil war and its devastating effects on the country. So when imperialist powers fight over influence in places, it's usually the people of those places who are disadvantaged most or get killed first. And let's not forget the CIA that conducted secret operations to influence African politics. A notable example is their involvement in overthrowing Ghana's first president, Kwame Nkrumah, in 1966 due to his socialist leanings and Soviet ties. So we can't help but to meddle in the affairs of African countries because of the resource wealth is so great. The U.S. also used aid and trade agreements as tools to keep African countries aligned with Western interests. Kenya, for instance, received significant economic support to maintain its pro-Western stance. This comes, of course, from what we know now from the IMF, right, and the World Bank. These are one of the main soft power peddlers in the game. Western powers provided military aid and training to strategic allies. The U.S. supported Ethiopia pre-1974 and Somalia militarily to counter Soviet influence in the Horn of Africa. Western countries encouraged African nations to adopt capitalist economic models and reject socialist policies. This pressure shaped economic and political decisions across the continent. Now, this, as you may or may not know, this wasn't even a matter of just Africa. This was the textbook playbook, let's say, of the United States all over the world for the last 100 years. And finally, the U.S. and its allies used their influence in international organizations like the UN to isolate African countries that aligned with the Soviet Union, affecting their global standing and access to resources. So you might say, well, this whole relationship with Botswana is innocuous, or whether or not we go in there with our companies or what kind of deal they're getting, it's just the price of doing business. It's just global trade. Well, there's more to it because our reputation, long-standing, is one of colonialism, genocide, apartheid, uh, all the tides, all the bad ones, all the bad things that you can think of. So here is the global consumer demand for jewelry. I didn't go over this. The US is the one that buys it all. Look at this. 52% of all consumer demand for diamonds it goes to the US. So you're looking at it right here. It goes from Botswana over to the US. And that's it. And for no other reason, guys, than the fact that it's a cultural significant thing. It's something that we arbitrarily decided had value. Now, they use lasers to cut things in manufacturing and stuff. I understand that there are other things we use diamonds for. Fine. It's great. Most of them are because the wife needs a diamond ring, you know. This is unfortunately another form of stupidity that humans are taking part in. What the kids would call conspicuous consumption, right? It doesn't serve a purpose in your life, but having that diamond ring on your finger makes you aligned with your tribe, let's say. Yeah, and this is an old map of the protectorate, of course, and it's just a big chunk cut out. The borders look a lot different today. This is a shot of right after independence in Botswana, and of course, this is this other guy from buddying up with the West, as it were. So there you go. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. What do you guys think?